Lord, take our minds and think through them, take our lips and speak through them, take our hearts and set them on fire with love for you. Amen.
Amen.
It's interesting that as we approach the 4th of July holiday, the day we celebrate Independence Day, we celebrate our freedom, that the second reading, Paul's letter to the Galatians, actually begins with the word freedom. For freedom, God has set us free. And of course here, Paul is talking not so much about a freedom of how much freedom we have the right to do whatever we want to do, but he's talking about how we have the freedom to make a choice. We have the freedom to make a choice about how we live our lives. And the way he describes that choice is this. He says we have the choice to either choose to live our lives by the Spirit, or we have our choice to live by the ways of the world. That's what he means when he says the flesh. Whenever Paul says flesh, what he's talking about are the ways of the world. So the choice is, do we live our lives living by the way that the Spirit would lead us, or do we live our lives living by the way that the world just usually goes about doing things? And then in that reading, Paul gives us two lists. One list that is supposed to be describing what it looks like when we're not living by the Spirit, and one list that describes what it looks like when we are living by the Spirit. And of course, on that list of the things that don't look like the Spirit, there's some big ones like fornication. Things that we can look at those and say, well, I'm not going to do that anyway, so why should I pay attention to that list? But if you actually read that list, it gets to some things that could be a little worrisome in our own lives. It talks about quarrels. It talks about anger. It talks about dissension. It talks about factions, all being ways that are signs that we're not living by the Spirit. Then on the other hand, you have the list of what it looks like if we are living by the Spirit. And you see pretty much the things you would expect to see on that list. Things like love, joy, peace. And also some things that maybe are a little harder to live by, like patience, kindness, gentleness, generosity. So when you look first at these lists, it looks pretty clear-cut between the things that we ought not to be doing and the things that we ought to be doing. And of course, neither of those lists are intended to be all-inclusive. Together, they are supposed to just give us an idea and a way of thinking about what it looks like to make a choice between participating in the healing power of God or participating in the brokenness of the world. It's meant to remind us that not just anger and quarrels and all those things that on that list, but things like those. He even says other things like these. Things like those are ways that when we participate in them, we participate in the brokenness, the ways of the world. And that when we participate in those things on the other side, when we participate in that kind of self-giving love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and generosity and gentleness, at those times, we are participating in those things of the Spirit of healing, of the healing power of God's love. The problem is that as we try to live out our lives, it's not as easy to keep those two lists separate. They tend to get all crossed up together. And quite often we find that when we have started off with the best intentions of living by the Spirit of love, say, that somehow, while we're acting out on those intentions, the brokenness of the other starts just sort of creeping in before we even realize what has happened. Let me give you an example of what I mean. A husband comes home from work. He looks like something is bothering him. He has a scowl on his face, and he comes in. The wife, wanting to be a loving wife, sees him come in, and she says, "Uh-oh, what's the matter?" He says, "Nothing." She says, "No, there's bound to be something the matter. You don't always look like this. Something's the matter. What is it? Tell me." He says, "No, it's really okay. It's fine." A little more forcefully now, she says, "No, it's not fine. Something's wrong, and if we could talk about it, it probably would make you feel better." And he says, nothing's wrong, really. There's not a thing wrong. I'm fine. And then she says, but you're not fine. If you would just let me help you. And then he says, I'm fine. Just back off. And before you know it, what started as a loving intention has turned into a quarrel. Which, if it goes the way as most marital quarrels do when they start that way, it will keep going and keep going until the brokenness that crept in will break the whole evening for that couple. Because sometimes, when we start out with the best of intentions, when we're not aware of what the other person truly needs, and we simply try to act on our good intentions the way we would want to have good intentions acted on us without any notice to what the other person needs, the brokenness can creep in. But you see, we can always interrupt the brokenness. At any time in that example, either the wife or the husband could have stopped. They could have stopped participating in the brokenness and interjected a little bit of healing, a little bit of understanding, a little bit of gentleness, a little bit of stepping back and looking. Early on, the wife could have said, when it was obvious that the husband didn't want to talk about it, she could have said something like, look, I know you usually like to work this out on your own. Obviously, this isn't a good time to talk. Why don't you go ahead and just, do what you need to do. I'm going to go read my book. And, if you decide later you want to talk about it, we can. It would have interrupted the brokenness. Or the husband, on the other hand, could have realized that she was just trying to help. And without sacrificing what he needed, he could have said, I had a bad day at work. I really just want to be by myself for a while. I'm going to go back to the room and play solitaire on the computer, and I'll be back. And later on the night we can chat and get together. It would have interrupted the brokenness. At either time, either one could have done it, but they would have had to make a choice. Because it is much easier when you get into that trend to just keep feeding the brokenness. It's a choice. A freedom of choice we have, but it is always a choice to interrupt the brokenness and to choose to live by the Spirit instead of to live by the ways of the world. There's an old Native American tribal story that goes something like this. There was a grandfather and a grandson having a talk, probably around a fireplace, around a campfire, because that's where all the great talks happen in tribal stories. And the grandfather was listening as the grandson talked about some of the struggles he was having in his life. And the grandson finally told his grandfather, he said, grandfather, it's like there are two wolves living in my heart fighting with each other. There's the wolf that's the one that is vengeful and sometimes wants to be violent and just gets angry all the time. And then there's a wolf that's loving and compassionate. And it seems like it's always a struggle as to which one will win. And the grandfather said, son, I have the same thing happen to me. Always have. And the grandson said, well, which one usually wins? And the grandfather said, the one I feed. The one I feed. We can feed the wolf of brokenness. Or we can feed the wolf that knows how to interrupt the brokenness with love and compassion and understanding. It's always, always a choice. And it's not just about what happens between husband and wife. It also happens between parent and child. It happens between friend and friend. It happens between colleague and colleague. It happens between churches and churches and between people within churches. It happens between nations and nations and people within nations. We always have two wolves living in our hearts. If we feed the one that is brokenness, it will get more and more broken. If we feed the one that is healing, It will interrupt the brokenness and provide the opportunity for another way. To live by the Spirit is to choose the wolf, the way of love and compassion. May God help us to choose wisely. Amen.